Today we have a great discussion planned for you. We have a frequent guest of A Neighbor's Choice. He is the writer at the Substack. Tell me how this ends. Chris Bray, how you doing?
Great. How are you?
Doing well. So it's great having you back. We've done a lot on radio, but also one of these before, and it's always great to hear your thoughts on some of the emerging trends of our culture. Uh, you've got a few different posts that I think we could use as touch points, but I'm thinking, we go through a medley of some of the different things. What's your take on? I know you got a post on this swimmer, Riley Gaines, the competitor who was competing with the transgendered college athlete, and she got into a bit of a pickle recently where she was physically attacked and punched. Can you tell us a little bit about this story and your thoughts on this?
Yeah, Riley Gaines spoke at San Francisco State University talking about, and Riley Gaines has said she's not opposed to transgender identity. She has no issue with transgender people or people declaring their sexuality, but she says in a very limited argument, transgender, people who are biologically men who declare themselves transgender women shouldn't compete against women in sports. That's her whole argument. And we've seen in MMA, we've seen biological men who identify as trans women just beating the hell out of women who compete as female MMA fighters. We've had a couple of women whose skulls were fractured. We've seen the dramatic nature of sports competition involving men, biological men, competing against women. And all Riley Gaines wants to talk about is, let's welcome transgender identity. I'm cool with all of it, but let's not have transgender women compete, who are biological men, compete against biological women in sports. And because she went to San Francisco State University to speak against that, she was surrounded by a mob. She was punched a couple of times by a biological man who identified as a trans woman. She was chased by a mob. The police dragged her out of the room and ran her down the hallway, being chased by a mob of people screaming for her blood. And she had to hide in a classroom for 3 hours, surrounded by the police, barricaded into a class, while the police and college administrators negotiated with the crowd to release her. She had a flight out of town that she missed because she couldn't leave campus. She couldn't leave that room because she wasn't safe to leave. And
That was
after
not a
that
safe
event,
space.
right, she found a safe space on campus, surrounded by the police who wouldn't arrest people who were punching her, who said, like, please let her go home and stop hitting her. And after the event, San Francisco State University administration released a statement saying, how proud they were of the brave students who stood up to the monster Riley Gaines and fought against her vicious message. And, SFSU alumni are posting on Twitter about how proud they are. But the thing that strikes me, and I said this on my Substack, is a biological man, punched Riley Gaines. He punched a woman. And in almost all of life, if you're a man who beats up a woman, you're not a great guy. You're socially disfavored, I said, putting it gently. But if you're a man and you punch a woman and you're wearing lipstick and you say you're a woman, suddenly it's really awesome that you're beating up women because you're being brave and you're fighting for justice. And you're fighting against being a victim of society. And that woman who says that she accepts you, by the way, Riley Gaines said that she accepts trans women as women, which I'm less inclined to do than she is. But she said she accepts trans women as women. She just doesn't want to compete against them in sports. And for that, she was attacked and threatened. And the message is, that's good. it's good that men are beating up women because the men are trans women and they're fighting for justice. And I think we've seen that a lot. I think there's a woman who calls herself Parker Posey in New Zealand, who has held a series of rallies saying women are adult biological females. And she had a Let Women Speak rally, ironically enough, in New Zealand. And she was viciously attacked. She was attacked by a mob of men in dresses saying they're women, threatening her safety. The police had to drag her away to safety again. There's a guy named Billboard Chris in Canada who shows up at trans events with a sign that he wears that says, "Children can't consent to puberty blockers."
Can or cannot?
Can't. Okay. Cannot consent to puberty blockers. Children can't consent to medically altering their gender. And he gets attacked, he gets punched, he gets choked. And in front of the police, this happened in Vancouver, that he showed up at a trans event with a sign that said, "Children can't consent to puberty blockers." And he was surrounded by a mob of trans women screaming, yeah. They screamed at him for a few minutes with a crowd of police watching, and then a trans woman grabbed him by the throat and shoved him and started choking him. And the police said, well, you shouldn't have shown up with a sign that provoked them. Like, why would we arrest someone for that? So what I'm seeing happening all over the place, I think, is that, transgender identity is not new. We've had people identifying as transgender, used to say transsexual, for as long as human beings been alive. It's been a marginal human behavior throughout human existence. But it's becoming, I think, something very different now. It's becoming this fetishized behavior that's becoming much more popular than it's ever been. And what I think it's becoming, when you see trans women beating the hell out of people and getting away with it and being celebrated for it, when you see biological men beating up women and being celebrated as wonderful, brave, good people, I think people have figured out that trans identity is a kind of license for sociopathy, that if you want to hurt people, if you like being cruel, if you like being violent, if you say, well, I'm a transgendered woman, suddenly it's okay. Suddenly you're being brave and fighting for justice. So we're incentivizing people, I think, to use this identity as a mask for cruel, sadistic, sociopathic behavior. And I think it's becoming something different than what gender dysmorphia has generally been. I think it's becoming a violent social movement.
And it's, it reminds me of like a twisted version of Ric Flair saying, "To be the man, you have to beat the man," and that's what they're literally, they want to be something. So they feel they have to defeat it, and they can use physical aggression if necessary to do so. It's really motivated. That was that.
It's really interesting to think about trans women, biological men identifying as women, trying to defeat women, trying to shove women aside, resenting womanhood, saying, "I'm a woman," but resenting people who were born as women and who've lived all their lives as women.
They're angry at nature as it is created. That's what they're angry at.
Yeah.
Because aren't they saying that it's violence to, if you're on a dating site or something, or at a dating gathering, and someone comes up to you and if you turn them down, and they were a person who identified as trans, they're saying that's an act of violence, right? It's
a vicious act of bigotry to be a man who doesn't want to date a trans woman who has male genitalia. How dare you?
And they're saying that's violence, though. I think they actually say that's violence.
But I think, sort of ultimately underneath all of that, there's a lot of discussion for a few years, and people like Nick Fuentes, who proudly says that he's an incel, there was a lot of discussion about the idea that there's a kind of far-right identity associated with incel behavior.
Mhm.
But I think what we're seeing is this growing movement of people calling themselves trans women who say they're motivated by their gender dysphoria. They say they're motivated by feeling like they were born in the wrong body, but it seems to me that it's a kind of incel movement, that they're motivated by a hatred of women, and they're pretending to be something they hate in a way that attacks and erases the thing that they say they are. I think it's psychologically interesting and complex, but
If you can't beat them, join them.
if you can't beat them, join
I
them,
can't. If they can't
and then
win
beat
in the
them.
date, if they can't win in the dating competition game, then you just join the other side, and then you get them to fawn at you by force, right?
And
You
it
must
seems
fawn at me by force now, right? Because if I was just my old self, maybe you wouldn't give me the attention that others in my competition would get. But if I join your team, then you're forced by cultural norms that are being revolutionarily enforced to fawn and to revere and to socialize with and to admire and give attention to and all the things that they desire, right?
The important word you've just used in there is force. And I think one of the discussions that's been going on around gender identity is the idea that we should allow people to choose their gender. We should allow people to choose their identity, which to a significant degree, I think I favor human freedom. I believe in letting people make their own choices. I don't believe in forcing other people to participate in it. I don't believe in insulating people from the consequences of their choices. But whatever sexual identity you want to have, whatever sexual behavior you want to engage in, if I don't have to participate in your declaration of your identity, and I don't owe you anything because of it, I don't think I have a right to stop you or a reason to stop you. And the idea, the claim is people should be allowed to choose who they are. But the thing that's becoming interesting about it is exactly this idea of force and exactly this idea, the idea of coercion in transgender identity. We're seeing leaks and whistleblowers from gender-affirming pediatric clinics who say, parents bring children to us and the children say, oh, I'm depressed. Oh, I have anxiety. And we say, well, how about you could be on hormone blockers? Like maybe you were born in the wrong body. And we have an army now of transitioners. We have a growing movement of detransitioners who are young people, 20, 21 years old, who are saying, I was depressed, I was anxious, I was awkward as a teenager, and I was taken to a counselor, and the counselor immediately started pushing on me. Oh, well, you were probably born in the wrong body. You should think about hormone blockers. You should think about top surgery. That we have a growing group of people who've been coerced into transgender identity. And the social cover for that coercion, the social cover for that act of force, and what I would call an attack on people, an attack on people's mental well-being, is the cover that we're letting people be who they really are. And I don't think that's always true. I think there are people who have gender dysmorphia. I think there are not a lot of them. But I think to a significant degree, we're seeing vulnerable young people, autistic children, autistic teenagers who are depressed and anxious, who are being talked into transgender identity, and many of them are coming out of the other side. So everywhere coming out of the other side and saying, look, I was pushed into this. So everywhere you look at the discussion that's emerging around transgender identity, the discussion isn't really about sexual identity. The discussion isn't really about your body or about gender dysmorphia. The discussion is about force and coercion. there is an emerging discussion about, if you don't play along with what I say about my gender identity, I'm going to kick your ass. I'm going to corner you with a mob, and we're going to beat you up. And isn't that wonderful, because we're fighting for justice? And alongside that, young people are being pushed into gender identity and waking up a few years later and saying, I mean, I think we've talked about Jazz Jennings before, who was sort of the leading edge of transgender identity as a cultural movement on the reality TV show I Am Jazz. And Jazz Jennings was born as a boy and transitioned to a girl, with a mother who said, "Oh, I'm so excited that, you know, I'm able to support my beautiful daughter through this wonderful transition." Jazz Jennings now has been giving interviews where he's biologically male, says, "I don't know who I am. I don't know what body this is that I'm living in. I wake up every day feeling I'm not myself." So I think, you know, in a very broad way, we have a social conversation going on that's supposed to be about letting people be who they are, but in an increasingly clear way is about the opposite. It's not about freedom, it's about coercion. And the coding of coercion, the packaging of force and pressuring people to do things and forcing people to do things and threatening people into doing things, but saying it's about freedom, I think is really fascinating. Dark, ugly, but a fascinating thing to watch.
It's definitely more of the positivistic view of freedoms versus the negative view of freedom, right? Where it's like it's the inevitable conclusion of the Rousseau kind of positivistic notion of freedoms. I have a right to healthcare, I have a right to a home, and I have a right to a body that looks the way I feel, right? Whatever that is. But there's this kind of horror that comes about with an uncanny valley effect, right? Where it's like the more technology tries to get you closer and closer to the real thing, the more it creates a kind of, in my opinion, it looks like they're recoiling at horror at how the chasm is more noticeable the closer they become. You know, like I don't know how to explain it, but it's almost like when it was in its more older forms, the uncanny valley, because of technology or whatever and surgeries and things, maybe it wasn't as sharp and close in terms of undifferentiation. But now that it's closer, it creates more repulsion and aggression, which would be in keeping with mimetic theory, which Rene Girard said that, you know, we fight because of our sameness, not because of our differences, right? So the more we become the same, the more there's opportunity for, you know, conflict, because the irresistible urge to one up the other in a kind of tit for tat reciprocal desire for being, which is what we see here. It doesn't end well unless you have an off ramp where you can kind of maintain your sense of self in that sea of sameness. Like it's like that. Remember the Looney Tunes where they would have that two characters would start fighting and they turn into a dust cloud of dust and hands and stuff coming out, and then maybe Bugs Bunny would step out of that dust cloud and it would still keep going without him being in it, and he'd look at the audience with the kind of breaking of the fourth wall, that meta moment, be like, can you believe this? Like, what's the fight all about? Like, what's happening here? You know, and that kind of undifferentiation, I think, is what's driving this. And the more closer you become close to the object, you realize all the differences that still are manifest, like the difference in bone structure. It's hard to, you know, it's hard to stop the bone structure and musculature, right? That is at play with biological differences, and that comes into an existential horror, like a rebellion against nature, as it is. Like, why do I have these bone structures the way they are? And if you remind me anything about that, then I'm going to have to physically use violence. I am justified to stamp out your voice as a reminder of the horror of that uncanny valley, you know?
Yeah. Dylan Mulvaney, I'm sure you've seen Dylan Mulvaney everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Dylan Mulvaney says he's in something like day 400 of girlhood, not womanhood, but girlhood. Dylan Mulvaney had bones broken in his face and shaved down. to demasculinize his face. And when you're having your healthy body broken and altered to become the thing you want to pose as, I mean, it seems to me to be a kind of self-directed violence, that you're actually attacking your own body. And so for someone like that to be held out as a symbol of a healthy transition, a socially healthy transition, it's a celebration of destruction, a celebration of self-loathing dressed up as healthy behavior. And it looks to me all the time like there's a kind of cheerleading going on for us to fight each other and to hate each other. We had a school shooting in Tennessee where a transgendered former student broke into a Christian school and shot and killed 3 children and 3 staff members. And the protests after that, the protests in Tennessee after that shooting were leftist protesters holding up 7 fingers. Did you see this? 7 fingers, 7 victims. They said there were 7 victims of that shooting. The 6 people the transgender shooter shot. And the transgender shooter, a victim of her own shooting, because society broke her with its hate. I think the discussions around violence are insane, and a series of inversions, a series of you referred to the uncanny valley, a series of things that when you look at them, you see that they aren't what people are representing them as. We have a discussion that I think Ayn Rand said that the definition of reality is A equals A. We have a series of discussions in which people are telling you that A doesn't equal A, that a shooter is a victim along with people she shoots, that a man is a woman, that transgendered violence is to be celebrated and is a positive thing. We have this endless deployment of social symbols that are represented as things that they are not. And underneath it all, it feels to me like we're being pushed toward violence. We're being offered violence as a social path. And I don't know how consciously or how deliberately people are doing that. But that's the way it looks to me. That's the way it looks to me more and more often. I see more and more violence and more cheerleading for violence dressed up as social progress.
And the social construction theory basically says that language constructs reality, right? And if language and their intellectual foundations, language is a tool of power at all times. And therefore, language has violence inherent in it in terms of how you mold that language. It is your strategic positioning on the game of power that you're employing. So when they're redefining words to mean that, words or expressions are violence, therefore I am justified in my self-defense to use initiation of violence, that's just the inevitable consequence of their own worldview. That the Christian worldview is logos constructs reality, the word constructs reality, but the word is inherently nonviolent. The word is inherently love, and love covers all things, and love allows the rain to fall on the just as well as the unjust. That is the social ordering principle of the Christian worldview. Their worldview doesn't have that. Rain falls on those who deserve to be drowned in a flood of violence and vengeance, says their Lord. That's what it's about. And so Tucker Carlson made a recent speech where he said that this is a religious battle between Christianity and whatever, But of course, Christians can't war in a way that is violent, or else they're just betraying their own worldview and imitating the religion of their opponents. The only way out is a kind of radical self-emptying love, but everybody's afraid to try that because it's pretty scary when you see the what seems like this inevitable clash that people feel drawn towards magnetically,
But I think the opposition to something like a depressed child being put on hormone blockers and then having his or her body cut up. The opposition to that is being dressed up as hate, right? Like,
Sure,
you're a bigot, you're a hater. But looking at someone who wakes up at the age of 20 and says, "What happened to my body? Who am I? Why has my body been ruined? Why do I live inside a shell that I don't recognize?" The opposition to that is not bigotry and hatred. The opposition to that is love for the person who's been harmed. How that love manifests itself is, the next question, but the depiction of the opposition to the destruction of people's bodies as an act of hatred and bigotry is a kind of sickness that underlays the other sickness. People are trying to talk you into something that isn't real.
Yeah, because there's a hatred for the body that's at play here. I think that underlies this is that the body as given is something that is kind of contemptible if need be. It's glorified when necessary, like someone being a victim of a war zone. Their murder is glorified as an act of horrific victimization when that narrative is necessary for continuing our side of a war in our country. And the same thing goes for all these other examples. Like, okay, if someone's harmed, is this something that can be used as a glorification of our cause? Then showcase the harm of the body. If not, the body is expendable. So the body is secondary to your mentalist state, right? Your mind and your desires.
What's interesting to me about the hatred of the body right now, I think about people like Otto Dix and George Grosz who participated in World War I, although I don't think either of them ended up at the front, and came home from war, came home with their friends whose bodies were ruined and torn apart by war, and depicted war as the hatred of men's bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And became very angry at women, and painted all these sort of demeaning depictions of women because they were enraged by what had been done to men. War has been an assault on men's bodies throughout history, but where I think we've reached a really interesting moment is that in the struggle, the battle over transgender identity, there are men who are identifying as women and there are women who are identifying as men, but the trend over time, I think, goes much more toward the erasure of women. I come to view it over time as an assault on women's bodies more than an assault on male identity, although both are under attack. And I think we're seeing an attack on fertility. We're seeing an attack on productive sexuality. We're seeing an attack on sexuality as an act of procreation. We're seeing a decline in birth rates, in family connections. And I think that the transgender identity, the way it's playing out, the way women are competing against men who identify as women in sports, the way women are cutting their bodies, getting top surgery, the way men are beating women who object to their identity. It seems to me, I can't prove this, but it feels like this, that the social movement of transgenderism is becoming highly directed toward women's bodies and a hatred of women's bodies. And it feels to me like a hatred of women's bodies has to do with a hatred of human reproduction. It has to do with a hatred of the future, or a fear of the future. It feels to me like there's a sense we have, maybe a growing sense among people. And you hear a lot of young people say, oh, I'll never have children in a world where the climate is changing so fast. Why would I bring a child into, such a horrible world? I think we hear a growing discourse in which the future is dark and ruined. And in the face of that discourse, we see a growing attack on the bodies that carry children and bring them into being. So it feels to me, and I'm willing to be talked out of this, I'm willing to argue about it because I can't prove it, but it feels to me like an attack on human fertility and an attack on the future. And you see, the sort of globalist, futurist, transhumanist movement that says over and over again, the key to a healthy future is to sharply reduce human populations. How can we build a healthy world? Well, we can have a lot less people in it, or a lot fewer people in it. It feels to me like the violence we're seeing and the rage we're seeing is sort of a sublimated loathing of the future, or loathing of a fear of the human trajectory. We know that, or we suspect that the future is dark. And there's a kind of a growing desire to not center the family, and to not honor the family, and to not have a world that honors children and making children and bringing children into the world. It feels like we are competing with a dark view of the future, and that dark view of the future manifests as a dark view of the human body.
Yes. So important. The body and future are so integrated together in this conversation. So important. I hate to beat a dead drum. I mean, beat a dead whatever horse, but Christianity is the one that introduces the elevation of the human body as sacred, including children, by the way. Children were considered to be expendable in the Roman world, lesser humans, right? People who were not in your social class were lesser than you. Christianity ushers in the idea that whether you're sick and dying of the plague like your pagan neighbor who actually laughed at you as you were being torn apart, we run to their aid and give them aid in the midst of their shadow of death. That's the kind of God that pushes people towards helping their enemies, their former enemy, heal from a disease because the body is that important. And then you have the idea of the future. The future is something that Christianity comes up with, this idea that instead of the eternal return, like Nietzsche wanted us to get to, that eternal return of the sacrificial cycle of time, we would have a future, that the best is yet to come, right? And so to me, incarnational Christianity goes hand in hand with the idea that history is going somewhere. Well, if you don't believe history is going anywhere good, it's going to be tied in intuitively to my body is not good. And therefore, it is to be shaped with violence and through imposition of force, as you alluded to earlier.
Did you see David Zweig's piece?
No, what's that?
On his own Substack page about the church in Santa Clara. This was so fascinating. We're emerging into this world in which transgender identity as a movement, as a kind of angry rage-inflected movement is growing rapidly. But part of the interesting context of that for me is that we're emerging from a period where for 3 years, authorities repressed religious gathering, repressed religious expression. And David Zweig's piece at his own Substack page, which I think is called Silent Lunch, because of children who during the pandemic who were allowed to go to school but weren't allowed to talk to each other during lunch because it sends the virus out into the world. So sit there quietly and eat your sandwich until you can put your mask back on. David Zweig wrote this piece. He obtained court records that include a bunch of background on the public health response to the pandemic in Santa Clara County, where San Jose is. And there was a church, San Jose Calvary Chapel, that in response to orders that churches stop meeting, the churches during the pandemic make all of their religious worship and religious instruction and socialization as a church into Zoom meetings. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to meet in person. We're going to be together as a community. We're going to worship together as a community. And David Zweig has the records that show that Santa Clara County hired code enforcement officers to place that church under surveillance, to the point that they were doing things like hiding on neighboring properties and watching through binoculars and taking notes that said, 11:57 and 30 seconds, pastor hugs woman, no mask. And they have this extensive record of surveillance. They were counting cars in the parking lot, and at one point they got a court order forcing the church to allow code enforcement officers to enter the property so they could do things like hanging out in the hallways, taking notes about, two parishioners communicating face to face, no mask, Tuesday, 2:16 p.m. We're emerging from this period where authorities frantically, urgently, aggressively repressed religious gathering. And this is the moment in which a growing movement of people hate their bodies and are attacking their own bodies and tearing their own bodies apart. And hating people and attacking people who question their identity. So we've had this extraordinary, coercive, compulsory desocialization, and emerging from that period of isolation and desocialization, suddenly there's a growing movement of people who feel disconnected from other people and who feel uncomfortable in their bodies and hate their bodies.
Almost like it was an initiation ritual.
Almost like it was an initiation ritual. Like if you plan the destruction of human societies, what would you do differently? There's a piece, David Zweig has another piece today, at a different Substack, I think at the Free Press, which is Barry Weiss's Substack page, about a school in Rochester, New York, a progressive elementary school, a Waldorf school, I think, that is still having silent lunches in April of 2023, that still requires everyone to be masked indoors and outdoors at all times. And that because students have to take their masks off to eat lunch, is forbidding students to speak to each other while they eat. If they want to ask a teacher a question while they're eating, they have to stop eating and put down their sandwich and remask and go speak to the teacher and then return to their sandwich and remove the mask and silently eat there. So he says, it's 2023. They've had this masking and silent lunch rule in place throughout the pandemic. So a child who's in second grade now, who's been in elementary school for 3 years, has never spoken to another child at lunch or been spoken to by another child at lunch. A child at that school who started kindergarten 3 years ago has never had an unmasked conversation with an adult at that school. So as you isolate people and crush their connections and teach them that the human body is the source of great danger, and if another person is talking to you, there are viruses coming at you, danger, danger. When you tell people the human body can kill you because it has viruses in it,
you're going to need a license to have one eventually.
Well, I mean, why not, right? Like, why not license the human body? Then people hate their bodies and attack their bodies. I don't understand all of it. I don't understand the way all of it fits together. I don't think we'll understand all of it for a long time. But seeing the way all of these things fit together and the way all of this plays out, seeing us emerge from a period of social isolation and the aggressive suppression, repression of religious gathering and religious ceremony, and seeing that lots of people suddenly hate their bodies and are really angry about it is darkly fascinating stuff. I want to say, by the way, along the way through that discussion, that one of the things that David Zweig found happened in San Jose is when those public health enforcement officers went and surveilled the church. He says, and people dispute this, but he says that that the surveillance notes show that they were using the property of neighboring churches that let them do it, neighboring churches that agreed to shut down, neighboring Christian churches that agreed to stop meeting in person, that agreed to stop having worship services in person, and agreed to allow code enforcement officers to use their property to surveil another Christian church for the purpose of issuing fines and trying to get them to stop meeting in person for worship. Now, the pastor of one of those churches has said in the comments at David Zweig's Substack post that they didn't do that. But David Zweig says the records show that they did. So I don't know. I don't know who's correct there, who's telling the truth. But it looks like churches, Christian churches, participated in the repression of Christian churches. And I certainly know, because it happened in my own town, it happened where I live, that churches agreed to stop because the government told them to.
That's interesting that you point that out, and it makes me wonder. I want to ask you, since it is the title of your blog, tell me how this ends. This attack on the body. Just tell me how that ends. Where does it go next? Because in 3 years, 2 years, it's whatever they're on to then. Make whatever they're doing now seem kind of like, man, that was kind of mild. It's just again darkly fascinating in a scary way.
It is darkly fascinating. I think this week, I mean, I go back and forth, but this week I think it ends with a very ugly and violent confrontation. I think we see violence escalating. I think we've seen in the last month, we've seen a series of attacks on other people by people who identify as transgender, including the shooting at a Christian school in Tennessee, the attack on Billboard Chris in Vancouver, the attack on Riley Gaines at SFSU, the attack on Parker Posey Parker, she calls herself, in New Zealand. We're seeing a growing wave of you could call it anti-transgender violence, of trans people and people who identify as trans allies violently attacking people who question any portion of what they say, even to the extent of, again, Riley Gaines said, I accept transgender identity. Please don't compete against me in sports. She was attacked for that. So I think what I see is an escalation. I see a greater and greater amount of violence. And I think a lot of people are really tired of it. And I think as people get more and more tired of a more and more aggressive and violent confrontation and a greater and greater amount of coercion, I think it ends. I think it ends darkly. I've been thinking a lot about the way the 60s turned into the 70s. You had the civil rights marches and the free speech movement in Berkeley sort of showing up in coat and tie. And as the 60s progressed, the growing failure of the New Left project I think led to greater and greater violent confrontation. And there was this moment when the 60s of marches and protests turned into the 70s of the Weather Underground, the Symbionese Liberation Army, bombings and violent movements and targeted assassinations. There was a Puerto Rican separatist group in New York City that shot police officers and set up ambushes and shot police officers in the back. I'm not remembering the name of the movement, but there were a series of movements in the 70s, like the Weather Underground, led by Bill Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, that pulled off something like 1,000 bombings. And those groups sort of began to drift together, and you had the several different members of several different radical groups participating together in a Brinks armored truck robbery to try to fund radical movements. So I think as New Left discourse failed or was perceived as having failed, there were movements on the left that started turning toward violent confrontation. The Weatherman famously called into a radio show in Berkeley and said, "We're declaring war on the United States of America," and did it and started planting bombs. It feels to me like we're moving past the moment of protest and discourse and confrontation in the public sphere to the moment when people feel like, because what they've done has failed, it's time to move on to the violent phase. I would love to be wrong about that, but it feels like that's where we're heading.
How does that transition to an 80s moment where people,
right? and my perception of history is that much of history is cyclical, and that violent left-wing movements lead to a right-wing reaction, and bad times lead to good times, and all of those things. I think the transgender movement in its current form doesn't go on and can't go on, and especially in the face of the growing detransitioner movement. I think it ends, but I don't think it ends quickly or cleanly. I think there's going to be real ugliness.
That's too bad. Let us hope that we can build an alternative path away from that ugliness and violence. Chris, I really appreciate your time, and as always, I want folks to check out your Substack, chrisbray.substack.com. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.